The recording chamber was deep within the Vorgon Imperial archives, a place of hushed reverence and data-chilled air. Stone, ancient and dark, formed the walls, etched with the lineage of Vorgon high command stretching back millennia. The veteran, Vorlag, his scaled hide now more ash than the obsidian it once was, settled his considerable frame into the grav chair. Its anti-gravity field hummed a faint protest against his bulk, a testament to the warrior he had been. Before him, the younger, sleeker form of High Command Archivist Rylus shimmered slightly as the room's soft light caught his polished neck frill. Rylus adjusted the optical recorder, its multifaceted lens aimed squarely at Vorlag. "State your designation and the purpose of this record, veteran," Rylus intoned, his voice smooth, professional, betraying none of the curiosity that flickered in his amber eyes. For a junior archivist, this assignment was unusual. Testimonies of this nature were typically sealed, relegated to dusty sublevels of historical data. Vorlag's jowls, heavy with age and memory, quivered slightly before he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like distant seismic activity. "I am veteran Vorlag, formerly of the 17th Vorgon Shock Infantry Claws of the Empire. This record, this is for the annals, for those who come after, so they might understand the nature of the enemy we faced during the Orion Spur Campaigns." Rylus made a minute adjustment. "The campaigns against the Terran Confederacy, standard historical archiving procedure, veteran. Your combat logs and after-action reports have been part of the primary record for cycles." A dry, rasping sound escaped Vorlag, the Vorgon equivalent of a mirthless chuckle. "Logs and reports," he rumbled. "Lines of data, casualty, figures, strategic assessments. They tell you what happened, archivist. They don't tell you how. They don't convey the texture of it." He paused, his gaze unfocusing, looking past Rylus, past the stone walls into a time he clearly wished he could forget. "The Orion Spur Campaigns," Vorlag continued, his voice dropping. "We Vorgons went into that conflict with the full might and pride of an empire that had pacified 1,000 systems. We had faced the Krill swarm and broken their chitinous tide. We had outmaneuvered the cunning of the Solarian free traders. We believed we understood war in all its terrible facets." He leaned forward slightly, the grav chair groaning in sympathy. "We were wrong. Fatally wrong." Rylus's head tilted, a subtle sign of increased attention. The Terrans were underestimated, it is documented. Underestimated? Vorlag's eyes, ancient and yellowed, snapped into focus, pinning Rylus with an intensity that made the younger Vorgon instinctively want to recoil. Archivist. They were a living nightmare given form. We had metrics for their ship strength, their weapons yields, the physiological limits of their species. We had files upon files. None of it prepared us for the truth of them. He gestured with a 3-taloned hand, the movement slow but deliberate. Our doctrines, refined over centuries of conquest and defense, were built on principles of honor, of battlefield clarity, of predictable engagement. The humans, they had no such fetters. Or if they did, they were so alien to our own. They might as well have been the chaotic flailings of mad creatures. The silence in the chamber deepened, broken only by the faint hum of the archival systems. Vorlag seemed to gather himself, the effort visible in the slight tremor of his claws. "I am old, Archivist Rylus," he said, his voice regaining its measured, somber tone. "My time ebbs. But before I pass into the great dust, there are things that must be said, things that cannot be captured in your neat data streams. Understand this. The humans did not fight like warriors as we understood the term. They did not merely seek to defeat us." He looked directly into the multifaceted lens of the recorder, as if addressing all future generations of Vorgon. "They fought like specters born of the void itself. They fought to unmake us. And the chilling truth, the one that still keeps me from restful cycles, is how terrifyingly good they were at it." Vorlag's gaze drifted to the far wall, where shadows danced like half-formed memories. "I will start with the events at Bastion Orbital 7. It was there we first truly glimpsed the abyss of their unconventional minds." Veteran Vorlag paused, the silence in the archival chamber stretching, thick with unspoken dread. Archivist Rylus waited, his usual professional composure now tinged with a visible apprehension. The old warrior's introduction had been unsettling enough. The promise of specifics was more so. Bastion Orbital 7, Vorlag began, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It was our bulwark in the Epsilon Eridani system. Not merely a fortress, but a symbol of Vorgon dominance. Heavily, armed, bristling with our finest energy projectors, shielded to withstand a fleet's barrage, and garrisoned by 3 full claws of our most disciplined troops. By all our calculations, it was impregnable to direct assault by the Terran forces arrayed against it. Their fleet was smaller, their capital ships demonstrably weaker in direct confrontation. He shifted in the grav chair. The Terrans, it seemed, agreed with our assessment. They made no grand attempt to storm our gates. Instead, they probed, small, almost insignificant skirmishes at the periphery of the station's sensor range. Feints. Easily repulsed. We logged them as signs of desperation, of an enemy testing unbreakable walls and finding them so. Vorlag's lip curled, a brief, bitter expression. Pride, Archivist. It is a potent intoxicant, and a terrible veil. The initial Terran fleet elements withdrew after a few cycles of these probes. Vorlag continued. Command interpreted it as a retreat, a tacit admission of our superiority. Morale on Bastion Orbital 7 was high. Too high. Then came the anomalies, he said, his voice dropping. Minor at first. A flicker in the power grid here, a sensor ghost there. Maintenance crews reported strange energy signatures within service conduits. Too faint to pinpoint. We dismissed them. Solar flares, system glitches. The station was vast, complex. Such things occurred. Rylus leaned forward slightly. But they weren't glitches. Vorlag's gaze was distant. No, they were whispers, the first signs of the rot. We learned later that during those insignificant skirmishes, the humans had deployed specialized infiltration pods, no larger than our maintenance drones. Tiny, sensor-baffled things designed to breach the station's outer hull, through forgotten exhaust ports or micrometeoroid impact sites too small for our automated repair systems to flag as urgent. Inside these pods were not platoons of warriors but individuals, saboteurs, ghosts, and among them this Sergeant Anya Sharma. Nyx, they called her, a fitting moniker. She moved through the station's guts like a shadow, her team a whisper in the machine. He clenched, a gnarled talon. Our internal security was robust, designed to repel boarders who came through obvious breaches, not phantoms who were already inside, moving through Jeffries tubes and power conduits. Places no sane Vorgon warrior would tread for long. The humans, it seemed, had no such aversion to confined spaces or the reek of ozone and recycled air. Theodry, first major sign something was terribly wrong was when the primary ammunition fabricators for Sector Gamma's defensive batteries went offline. No explosion, no alarm. They just stopped. Then, Sector Beta's atmospheric controls began to fluctuate wildly, cycling from near vacuum to crushing pressure. Communications within the station became unreliable, filled with static, sometimes distorted voices. Our own voices twisted into mockery. Vorlag paused, the memory clearly painful. High command on the station believed it was a sophisticated cyber attack. Our technicians raced to secure the network, to purge the virus. But it wasn't just in the network, Archivist, it was in the walls. Sergeant Sharma and her kind, they weren't just hackers. They were gremlins, manually rerouting power, planting microcharges, disabling critical systems with an almost surgical precision. The turning point, Vorlag rumbled, was when the station's own automated defense turrets in the main transit corridors began firing, not at some phantom enemy, but at us. Vorgon troopers moving to secure a reported breach were suddenly cut down by the very weapons meant to protect them. Panic, for the first time, began to ripple through our ranks. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you defend against your own fortress? Imagine, Archivist. Vorlag's voice was barely above a whisper now, heavy with the remembered horror. "You are in the command center, shields holding against a distant token Terran fleet." Suddenly the lights go out. Emergency power kicks in, dim and red. Then, the fire suppression system activates, not with water, but with a choking, disorienting gas siphoned from the industrial sections. Your own life support is trying to suffocate you. The doors seal, trapping units in compromised sections. The internal comms squawk, not with orders, but with human laughter. He closed his eyes briefly. Sergeant Sharma. Her team didn't conquer Bastion Orbital 7 with overwhelming force. They dissected it. They turned its strength against itself. They made its metallic heartbeat to their rhythm. We weren't fighting a battle for the station anymore. We were trapped inside a dying beast, and its claws were tearing at its own flesh. When the main Terran fleet finally did advance, it wasn't to assault a fortress. It was to pick through a carcass. Most of the station's primary weapon systems were offline, or actively targeting other parts of the station. Our chain of white command was shattered. We were fighting shadows, and the station itself had become our deadliest enemy. Vorlag looked at Rylus, his ancient eyes burning. That was our first true lesson in human warfare, Archivist. They didn't just seek to occupy territory or destroy assets. They sought to dismantle your reality, to turn your strengths into fatal weaknesses. They were not warriors in the grand tradition. They were an infection, a creeping, insidious force that rotted you from within. And Sergeant Anya Nix Sharma, she was the architect of that particular nightmare. Archivist Rylus remained silent for a long moment after Vorlag finished recounting the fall of Bastion Orbital 7. The younger Vorgon's smooth neck frill, usually held erect with unconscious pride, seemed to droop slightly. The air in the chamber felt colder. Physical infiltration and sabotage are effective if dishonorable tactics, Rylus finally said, his voice carefully neutral, though a tremor of unease was now detectable. But the Terrans didn't stop there, did they, veteran? Vorlag's eyes, ancient and knowing, fixed on the archivist. No, Rylus, they did not. What they did to Bastion Orbital 7 was a prelude, a demonstration of their physical cunning. But the Orion Spur Campaigns were long, fought across many worlds, many installations, and it was in the grinding sieges, the prolonged standoffs, that we encountered another facet of their unsettling nature. Their mastery over the warrior's mind. He leaned back, the grav chair sighing. The Vorgon psyche is strong. We are trained from hatching to resist fear, to maintain discipline under the most harrowing fire. Our mental fortitude is a cornerstone of our military doctrine. We believed it unbreakable. A shadow passed over Vorlag's features. The humans, however, seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of how to crack even the strongest mental armor. Not always with sophisticated technology, but with whispers, with shadows, with the insidious creep of dread. I recall the siege of Outpost Xylos, no relation, merely an unfortunate coincidence of nomenclature, on the desolate moon of Praxis. It was a bleak, isolated rock, but strategically vital for its deep space listening arrays. Our forces were well entrenched, supplies adequate for a protracted engagement. The Terrans established a loose blockade, clearly lacking the numbers for a direct assault. For days there was nothing but the silence of space and the occasional distant flicker of their patrol ships. Then, the whispers began. Vorlag's voice grew quieter. Our comm channels, military grade, encrypted, suddenly started picking up anomalies. Not direct messages, not at first, but bursts of static that, if you listened long enough, seemed to resolve into faint, distorted sounds. Sometimes it was like Vorgon speech, but twisted, guttural, speaking of betrayal from within our ranks, of tainted supplies, of commanders withholding vital information. Other times, he continued, his gaze distant. It was simpler, more primal. The sound of claws scraping on metal, broadcast at irregular, unpredictable intervals, always seeming to come from just outside your viewport, or from the corridor beyond your barricade. We'd send out patrols. Nothing. We'd scan. Nothing. But the sounds would return, gnawing at the edges of our resolve. Then came the visual disturbances. On Praxis, the humans had limited means to project true illusions. but they were masters of improvisation. This is where operatives like their Corporal Kenji Tanaka, Spark, they called him, excelled. He was an engineer, not a frontline soldier in the traditional sense. His tools were not pulse rifles, but cobbled together projectors, salvaged sonic emitters, jury-rigged sensor decoys. Vorlag described how Tanaka's teams would use captured Vorgon maintenance drones, retrofitted with small low-power projectors, to cast fleeting, unsettling shadows in the dimly lit periphery of Vorgon patrols. Shapes that resembled distorted human figures, or worse, monstrous caricatures of Vorgon folklore, tales meant to scare hatchlings, suddenly given a terrifying, fleeting substance in the dark. They exploited our own culture against us, Vorlag rumbled. Things we hadn't thought of in cycles suddenly felt real. The Krill swarm, our old enemy. Their tactics were brutal but straightforward. Swarm and overwhelm. The humans, they were artists of unease. On Praxis, Vorlag said, his voice heavy, Corporal Tanaka's group found a way to tap into the outpost's internal PA system. They didn't shout threats, instead they played music. Human music. Some of it was discordant, aggressive, designed to agitate, but other times it was hauntingly melodic, yet utterly alien, filled with a sorrow or a longing that resonated in some deep, uncomfortable way, making our warriors feel isolated far from the Empire's heart. And sometimes, most chillingly, they would broadcast silence. Absolute, profound silence for hours. After days of constant, low-level auditory harassment, that silence was a pressure all its own, pregnant with unspoken menace. The strain began to show. Troopers became jumpy, irritable. Trust eroded. Was that flicker in the shadows real, or a trick? Was the whisper on the comms a human ploy, or was your squadmate truly losing his nerve? The humans rarely launched major attacks during these periods. They didn't need to. They were letting our own minds do their work for them. Vorlag looked directly at Rylus. I witnessed a Claw brother, a veteran of 20 cycles, decorated for valor against the Krill break, not under fire, not in glorious combat. He broke in the dead of a Praxis night, screaming about the silent watchers and the songs in the static, convinced the very walls were listening. He charged out into the sterile plains, firing wildly at nothing. The humans didn't even need to expend a shot. He was lost to us, and his fear was a contagion. That, archivist, Vorlag concluded, his voice a grim whisper, is a different kind of warfare, to turn a soldier's own mind into his most potent enemy. It was insidious, and it was bone-chillingly effective. The humans understood that the battle for morale, for sanity, was as critical as any exchange of fire. It was a lesson we Vorgons learned at a terrible cost. Archivist Rylus adjusted the optical recorder, its lens an unblinking eye absorbing veteran Vorlag's every word, every pained flicker of his ancient eyelids. The account of human psychological warfare had left a palpable chill in the room, a stark contrast to the usually sterile and ordered environment of the Imperial Archives. Their tactics were unconventional, insidious, Rylus conceded, his voice a low murmur. Designed to bypass traditional strengths, but surely, veteran, in direct confrontation, when courage is pitted against courage, firepower against firepower, the superior training and martial discipline of the Vorgon warrior would prevail. Vorlag's response was a slow, deliberate exhalation, like the sound of wind through a ruined city. That was our fervent belief, archivist, our comfort, that when the lines were drawn, when there was no room for trickery or ghosts in the machine, our innate strength would assert itself. The cinder fields of Eridanus 6 disabused us of that notion in the most brutal fashion imaginable. He paused, gathering his thoughts, the memories like shards of obsidian in his mind. Eridanus 6 was a volcanic hellscape, all jagged peaks, and plains choked with black glassy ash, the cinder fields as the humans aptly named them. Strategically, it was a nightmare to hold, yet vital for its promethium deposits. A human expeditionary force, numbering perhaps 2 standard battalions with light armor support, had established a mining and refining operation there. We descended upon them with 3 full claws, heavy assault craft, and superior air cover. By all projections, it should have been a swift, decisive engagement, annihilation or immediate surrender. Vorlag's talons curled. The humans chose neither. Their commander, a Colonel Aris Thorn, if memory serves, must have known. The odds were impossible. His forces were outmatched, outgunned, and with our fleet controlling orbit, utterly cut off. Standard doctrine, our doctrine, would have dictated a tactical withdrawal to minimize losses, or failing that, an honorable surrender once the futility of resistance was clear. Instead, Vorlag continued, his voice tinged with a reluctant awe, they dug in, not into elaborate fortifications. There was no time. They used the jagged volcanic terrain itself. They turned lava tubes into ambush points, razor-edged rock formations into cover. Their engineers, likely under the guidance of more individuals like this Corporal Spark Tanaka, reconfigured mining equipment into makeshift weapons. Seismic charges became area denial munitions. Ore cutters became anti-vehicle lasers of terrifying, if short-lived, power. Our initial assault was costly, Vorlag admitted, a flicker of ancient pain in his eyes. We expected a disciplined, but ultimately brittle defense. We found a nest of enraged sand vipers. They fought with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal. Every meter of ash we gained was paid for in Vorgon blood. Their snipers, nestled in volcanic vents, picked off our officers with unnerving accuracy. Their light infantry, mobile and elusive, would let our heavy units pass, then strike at our vulnerable supply lines and rear echelons from unexpected quarters. He described the scene. Vorgon assault walkers designed to inspire terror, bogged, down in treacherous ash, their leg servos targeted by humans armed with magnetic charges that barely slowed a walker, but could cripple a joint. Vorgon air support, harried by surprisingly accurate ground fire from human missile teams who changed positions with bewildering speed, disappearing into plumes of volcanic smoke. It wasn't just their tactics, archivist, Vorlag stressed. It was their unyielding spirit. We'd overrun a position, count their dead, and assume the fight was out of that sector. Then, from a hidden crevice or a collapsed tunnel, the survivors would re-emerge, sometimes just a handful of them, fighting with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. They simply would not break. I remember one particular ridge, he said, his voice dropping. The Last Stand Ridge, our troopers called it later. A small human platoon, maybe 30 of them, cut off, wounded, ammunition clearly, running low. Our commander offered them surrender. Their response was a volley of remarkably precise fire. We assaulted that ridge 3 times. 3 times our shock troops, the pride of the Empire, were thrown back by a handful of humans who seemed to feed on desperation itself. It was there, Vorlag said, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the archival chamber wall, that I saw something that reshaped my understanding of them. During a lull under the blood-red sky of Eridanus VI, we observed movement among the human dead and wounded. We assumed it was scavengers, or perhaps a final desperate attempt to regroup. It was their medics. Rylus tilted his head. Medics? Engaging in combat? Not initially, Vorlag corrected. They were tending to their fallen under fire, with a disregard for their own safety that was astonishing. But then, one of our forward units, eager to press the advantage, advanced too quickly. They moved to engage the medics, perhaps to take prisoners, perhaps simply to end it. He paused, the memory vivid. The reaction was instantaneous. The wounded humans, those who could still hold a weapon, propped themselves up against the black rocks and opened fire. And the medics, by the void, the medics, they dropped their medical kits, drew their sidearms, or in one case a sharpened piece of shrapnel, and threw themselves at our troopers with a savagery that dwarfed even that of their frontline soldiers. They were defending their comrades, their patience, with a primal fury that was terrifying to behold. We were warriors of an empire, Rylus. We understood duty, honor, sacrifice, but this was something else. This was a ferocity born of a bond we couldn't comprehend, a refusal to yield even a fallen comrade. They inflicted casualties, those few medics and their wounded charges, far out of proportion to their numbers or capabilities. They fought until they were utterly overwhelmed. Vorlag leaned back, the effort of recollection etching new lines of weariness on his face. The cinder fields of Eridanus 6 were eventually taken. The human resistance was in the end extinguished. But the cost was staggering, and the lesson was seared into our collective memory. The humans possessed a resilience, an indomitable will to fight for every breath, every inch of ground, every comrade, that defied all our combat projections. They were not merely difficult to kill, they were almost impossible to truly defeat in spirit. Veteran Vorlag took a slow, deliberate sip from the bulb of nutrient fluid Rylus had silently offered him. The archivist, for his part, was no longer attempting to maintain a facade of detached professionalism. His neck frill remained slightly lowered, and his usual precise movements were now more subdued, almost hesitant. The tales of Eridanus the Sixth had clearly resonated. Their resilience was formidable, Rylus stated, his voice softer than before. To fight with such tenacity, when all hope seems lost, it speaks to a certain stubbornness inherent in their species. Vorlag made a low sound in his throat, a complex Vorgon expression that could mean agreement, but also something more profound. Stubbornness, yes, archivist, but it was more than mere obstinacy. It was tied to something deeper, something we struggled to quantify, even after cycles of conflict. We saw it in how their medics fought, as I described. But the cinder fields were not the only place we witnessed this phenomenon. It was a consistent, baffling, and often lethal trait, the lengths to which humans would go for one another. He set the bulb down. Vorgon warriors value unit cohesion. We fight for the honor of our claw, for the glory of the Empire. A comrade's fall is a sorrow, a spur to vengeance. But our doctrines are clear on acceptable losses, on the strategic value of an individual warrior versus the objectives of the campaign. There are calculations, there are limits. The humans, Vorlag rumbled, shaking his massive head slowly, seem to operate under an entirely different set of equations that, to our military strategists, were pure madness. I recall an engagement in the asteroid belt of the Helios system, a protracted, messy affair of skirmishes between mining outposts and patrol craft. During one such skirmish, a human light transport, damaged and disabled, was boarded by one of our raiding parties. Standard procedure. They secured the vessel and took 5 human prisoners, a pilot, an engineer, 3 infantry, nothing of remarkable rank or strategic importance. The capture was clean, Vorlag continued. Minimal casualties on our side. The prisoners were disarmed and secured. The transport was scheduled to be stripped for salvage. According to our tactical assessments, the remaining human forces in the sector, a few scattered patrol craft and a lightly armed frigate, were significantly outmatched and should have disengaged, preserving their strength. That would have been the logical, the sensible Vorgon response. His eyes took on that distant, haunted look again. Instead, what we witnessed defied all reason. Within the hour, those scattered human vessels, ships we knew were low on ammunition and likely damaged from previous encounters, converged on the captured transport's location. They didn't send a delegation to negotiate. They didn't make a strategic withdrawal to report and regroup. They attacked. Rylus frowned. Attacked your raiding party? Which presumably had support. Not just the raiding party, archivist. They threw themselves at the Vorgon cruiser that had overseen the capture, a vessel that outgunned their combined strength by a factor of 10. It was a suicidal gesture, by any sane military standard. Their frigate charged headlong, spitting its last reserves of energy into our shields, while their smaller patrol craft like angry insects darted in, trying to draw fire, trying to create an opening that simply wasn't there. Vorlag leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. Our commander was perplexed. He hailed them, demanding to know the meaning of this pointless aggression. Their response, unencrypted, raw, was simple. Give them back. Give them back, Vorlag repeated, as if still tasting the disbelief. 5 insignificant prisoners. For this, they were willing to sacrifice a frigate and multiple patrol craft, along with their crews. Our analysts were frantic, trying to understand. Were these prisoners high-value targets in disguise? Did they possess some critical intelligence we had overlooked? We reinterrogated the captives. They were exactly what they seemed. Low-ranking personnel. The human attack was pressed with a ferocity that was shocking. They knew they couldn't win. They knew they would likely die. But they fought with the desperate energy of a cornered predator trying to protect its young. Their frigate was eventually crippled. Its reactor core breached, but not before its final defiant salvo managed to score a lucky hit on our cruiser's primary sensor array. And then, Vorlag said, his voice heavy, came the truly unbelievable part. As their frigate was tearing itself apart, one of their small, heavily damaged patrol ships, barely spaceworthy, its hull visibly fractured, made a direct, suicidal run on the captured transport where the prisoners were held. The pilot must have known it was a one-way trip. He didn't fire. He didn't attempt to dock. He rammed our boarding party's docked assault shuttle, the one connecting them to the human transport. The explosion was considerable. It destroyed the shuttle, the human patrol craft, and severely damaged the docking clamps on the transport. Rylus looked stunned. To what end? Chaos, Archivist, and opportunity. In the confusion with our boarding party momentarily, cut off and disoriented, 2 other human patrol craft, damaged but still fighting, swept in, not to engage our cruiser, but to blast open a section of the transport's hull near where their comrades were held. We saw it on our short-range scans, human figures in emergency void suits, pulled from the breach by their rescuers, who, then against all odds, managed to disengage under the cover of the ongoing, albeit failing, main assault. They didn't get all of them. 2 of the original 5 prisoners were lost in the chaos, along with the pilot who rammed the shuttle. But they retrieved 3. 3. For the cost of a frigate, multiple patrol ships, and dozens of lives. Vorlag shook his head. Our strategists ran the engagement simulations for cycles. No algorithm could account for such a decision. The cost-benefit analysis was ludicrous. I saw one of those rescued humans, just a glimpse on a grainy gun camera feed before they vanished into the asteroid field. He was clearly wounded, leaning heavily on another, yet he had a functioning pulse rifle in his hands. As their small craft pulled away, he twisted, bracing himself against the frame, and fired a final defiant burst towards our cruiser. It was futile, a gnat spitting at a behemoth, but it was the spirit of it, Archivist. The sheer, unyielding determination to protect their own, to snatch them back from the void itself, no matter the cost. That day, Vorlag concluded, we learned that capturing a human was like seizing a cub from a Catharn sandlion. The act itself might be easy. Surviving the mother's response was another matter entirely. Their loyalty wasn't just to a cause or an empire. It was to each other, personal, fierce, and utterly, terrifyingly illogical. Archivist Rylus leaned back, the smooth contours of the grav chair no longer offering much comfort. He had heard of Vorgon warriors discomfited by battle, by loss, even by fear in its rawest form. But veteran Vorlag spoke of something else, a deeper unsettling that went beyond the physical threat of the Terrans. It was a confusion, a fracture in the expected order of things. Their bonds are extreme, Rylus finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. He adjusted his optical sensor, though the gesture was more out of habit than necessity. It explains the ferocity, the willingness to undertake actions we would deem profligate with lives and resources. Vorlag nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the polished stone floor as if seeing reflections of old battles there. Profligate, yes, but also, at times, something else. Something that didn't fit any profile our tacticians or xenopsychologists could devise. We had begun to paint them as monsters, Archivist. Efficient, terrifyingly adaptive, fiercely pack-bonded monsters. It was a horrifying image, but in its own way, A comprehensible one. Monsters have rules, even if they are monstrous rules. But then, Vorlag continued, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more introspective than before, you would encounter a glitch, a deviation in their behavioral code that was more chilling than any display of raw ferocity, because it hinted at a depth, a complexity, that made them utterly, terrifyingly unpredictable. He paused, and for the first time, Rylas saw a profound vulnerability in the old warrior's eyes. I experienced such a glitch myself. It wasn't on a grand battlefield. It wasn't a strategic masterstroke I witnessed. It was small, personal, and it has haunted me for cycles. It was during the final clearance of a hive-like urban sprawl on Cygnus X1's primary moon. A miserable, claustrophobic engagement fought block by block, room by room. My claw had been engaged for 3 rotations without relief. We were exhausted, on edge. The humans were dug in deep, fighting for every doorway, every stairwell. My squad was clearing a bombed-out hab block. We'd taken casualties. The air was thick with dust, cordite, and the metallic tang of Vorgon and human blood. We breached a small, sealed room, likely a panic room or a reinforced storage area. Inside, there was only one human soldier. Young. Barely more than a hatchling by our standards, though humans matured faster. He was cornered, Vorlag said, his voice flat. His weapon was damaged, useless. He had a leg injury, a bad one. Bone clearly visible through torn fabric. By all rights, by all the rules of engagement we had come to expect from humans, he should have fought to the death with whatever he had left. A combat knife, his fists, his teeth. Or seeing us, 3 fully armed Vorgon shock troopers, he should have shown terror, defiance, hatred. Vorlag looked up, meeting Rylas's gaze. He did none of those things, Archivist. He just looked at us. His face was pale, streaked with grime and sweat, and in his eyes, there was fear, yes, but beneath it something else. Resignation, and a profound weariness that mirrored our own. My claw brother Krelak, young, aggressive, his nerves frayed, raised his pulse rifle to finish him. Standard procedure. A cornered, wounded enemy is still an enemy. But the human, Vorlag continued, his voice barely audible. He didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't even try to shield himself. He just watched the rifle come up. And then, he did the most unexpected thing. He reached slowly into a pouch on his belt, his movements telegraphing no threat. My other squad mate tensed, ready to fire. But I hesitated. There was something in the human's demeanor. He pulled out a small flat object. Metal, with a hinged cover. He fumbled it open with one hand. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a detonator. Vorlag's ancient jowls quivered. It was what humans call a photograph, a still image. He held it out, not towards us aggressively, but almost showing it to us. Or perhaps just looking at it himself one last time. Krelak snarled, "What trickery is this, human filth?" But I motioned him to hold. I could see the image from where I stood. It showed the young soldier, younger still, smiling, his arm around a female human and a small human child, all of them squinting in bright sunlight, green foliage behind them. A scene of peace, of belonging. He looked from the photograph, to me, then back to the image. And he said, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper, "They're waiting, tell them I was brave." The archival chamber was utterly silent save for the faint hum of its systems. Vorlag's breathing was heavy. "Brave?" Vorlag repeated, the word tasting alien on his tongue. He wasn't asking for mercy. He wasn't trying to bargain. It felt like a statement, a request for a message to a world he knew he'd never see again, from an enemy who had every reason to kill him without a second thought. Krelak was about to fire, but I couldn't let him. I gestured again, an override command. I told the human, "There is no one to tell. Your fight is over." Vorlag paused. He just nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving that photograph. Then he closed it, tucked it back into his pouch and closed his eyes, waiting. We didn't kill him. The admission hung in the air, heavy and strange. I ordered my squad to secure him as a prisoner. Krelak protested, calling it weakness, sentimentality. But it wasn't sentimentality, Rylus. It was... I don't know what it was. A sudden, jarring recognition of something beyond the battlefield. A glimpse of the life they fought to protect. Not just the ferocity with which they protected it. This human, this boy, he showed no relief when we lowered our weapons, no gratitude, just that profound, weary acceptance. Later, at the processing camp, he succumbed to his wounds before any real interrogation could take place. I never learned his name. Vorlag looked at Archivist Rylus, whose own amber eyes were wide, his usual composure utterly gone. That is the glitch, Archivist. That is the moment that chills me more than the memory of Sergeant Sharma's ghosts or the suicidal fury of their defenders. The capacity for such quiet dignity, such personal connection, in the face of certain death, from a member of a species that could also be so brutally, terrifyingly effective in war. It meant they weren't just monsters. They were something far more complex, and therefore far more unknowable. How do you fight an enemy? Vorlag whispered. Who can unmake your fortresses with cold cunning, shatter your morale with whispers in the dark, meet your legions with suicidal bravery, and then, in a quiet moment, show you a photograph of his family and ask you to remember his courage? The silence that followed Vorlag's account of the young soldier in the photograph was profound. It filled the archival chamber not with emptiness, but with the weight of unspoken questions, of paradigms shattered. Archivist Rylus, for the first time since the testimony began, seemed utterly at a loss for words. His neck frill, usually a proud display of his lineage and position, was completely slack, his amber eyes clouded with a mixture of horror, confusion, and a dawning reluctant understanding. Veteran Vorlag watched him, his ancient gaze holding a measure of somber empathy. He had carried these burdens for many cycles. Rylus was only now beginning to feel their chill. Finally, Rylus managed. The reports, the official histories of the Orion Spur Campaigns. They speak of human adaptability, of unconventional strategies. They detail casualty figures, territorial gains and losses. They analyze the technological disparities. He shook his head slowly, the gesture one of profound disillusionment. They say nothing of this. Vorlag nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Words on a data slate, Archivist, cannot capture the soul of a storm, and humanity in war was a storm of unparalleled and unpredictable fury. Yes, the Empire adapted. Our military doctrines were rewritten. Entire sections of the War College were dedicated to studying Terran tactics, or what we perceived to be their tactics. He gestured dismissively with a gnarled talon. We developed countermeasures for their infiltration techniques. We hardened our cyber warfare defenses. We learned to anticipate their flanking maneuvers, their exploitation of terrain, even their disconcerting tenacity. Our ships were redesigned, our armor improved. We became by necessity a more versatile, more cautious fighting force. And yet, Vorlag continued, his voice dropping to a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls. I fear we learned only the surface lessons. We studied their tools, their methods. We mapped their aggression. But the source of it, the strange, contradictory wellspring from which their warriors drew their terrifying strength and their equally unsettling moments of humanity, that I believe we never truly grasped. He leaned forward, the grav chair creaking in protest, his gaze intense. We encountered warriors like Sergeant Anya Nix Sharma, who could become ghosts in our most secure installations, turning our own strength against us with chilling precision. We faced engineers like Corporal Kenji Spark Tanaka, who could conjure fear from shadows and static, waging war on the mind as effectively as any pulse cannon. We bled on fields like Eridana 6, where human soldiers refused to yield, fueled by a resilience that defied all logic. We saw them launch suicidal attacks to retrieve a single fallen comrade, a display of pack loyalty so extreme it bordered on collective madness. And then, Vorlag's voice softened, We saw a dying boy show a picture of his family to his enemies, asking only that his courage be remembered. He looked at Rylus, whose polished hide seemed to have lost some of its sheen. How do you build a doctrine against that, archivist? How do you quantify an enemy who is at once a ruthless predator, a cunning strategist, a berserker, a martyr, and a poet of quiet despairs? Their capacity for cruelty was matched only by their capacity for sacrifice. Their pragmatism was often eclipsed by their sentimentality. They were a species of walking contradictions, and in that lay their most profound and terrifying strength. The Orion Spur Campaigns officially ended cycles ago, Vorlag stated. Treaties were signed, borders were drawn. A cautious peace, or at least an absence of open war, settled between the Terran Confederacy and the Vorgon Empire. But the echoes of their fire, Rylus, they still linger. He gestured around the archival chamber, a place dedicated to the preservation of Vorgon history, of their triumphs and their trials. We tell ourselves we understand them now. We have our reports, our analyses. We believe we are prepared for any future conflict. A dry, rasping sound, almost a sigh, escaped the old warrior. I am not so certain. I fear that what we learned was merely how to weather the storm, not how to comprehend the forces that drive it. We learned to fight the human, but we never truly learned to understand humanity. Veteran Vorlag rose slowly from the grav chair, his great frame casting a long shadow in the soft light. He looked at the optical recorder, then at archivist Rylus, who seemed to have aged several cycles in the span of the testimony. This is my final word for the record, archivist, Vorlag said, his voice firm, yet imbued with a deep and abiding weariness. We studied their weapons, their ships, their tactics. We analyzed their logistical chains and their industrial capacity. But we never truly studied them. The heart of their fire, the core of their contradictions. He turned towards the chamber exit, his steps heavy. At the threshold he paused, looking back one last time. And that, archivist Rylus, Vorlag concluded, his voice a somber echo in the sudden stillness, is why their ghosts still walk our halls. That is the unlearned lesson. May the Empire never have to face the final exam. With that, veteran Vorlag departed, leaving archivist Rylus alone in the sudden, profound silence of the chamber. Rylus stared at the now inactive optical recorder, its multifaceted lens dark. After a long, unblinking moment, he reached out a trembling talon and slowly, deliberately, deactivated the recording. The soft hum of the archives seemed louder now, the shadows in the corners deeper. On his usually impassive face, an expression of deep, uncharacteristic unease had settled, a reflection of the chilling truths he had just been privileged and perhaps cursed to hear.